And next up, we have got Kate Pasterfield. Kate is the Chief Innovation Officer at Sponge UK, and Kate is absolutely fantastic. You are going to love her session. She's going to be talking about data and learning science. Have a great time. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Kath. Yes, I'm really pleased to be here. It's such an honor to have been invited. And I am going to be talking a bit about data, exactly as Kath says, around kind of mastery, measurement, and motivation. So let's get into it, shall we? All right. So today, what I thought would be fun to cover is just a little bit about why data is important and the current state of adoption in L&D. I've got 6 ways that I tend to talk about data which I'll share with you, which are the inspiring ways that we can use it to enhance both the learning experience and to support the learning and development managers and departments. And then at the end, I'm going to share a tool that I hope may be able to give you something to think about while you're considering gathering data, because often we get to the end of a project and we think, oh gosh, I should have been thinking about this in the beginning, and actually, we need to be making that a forethought in our design process. So hopefully that will be a useful talking tool. So let's continue with this first question then. Why does data matter? And there have been some studies that have been conducted by groups like Towards Maturity, who've done some research into what it is that learning and development teams want data to achieve. And it tends to be around these 4 things. So they want to be able to track business impact. So really being able to show the achievements that they've accomplished in their teams and show how they can make a difference in their organizations. They want to be able to improve long-term decisions. So that's really kind of building up an evidence base for making better long-term decisions. And they want to enhance the experience. So for the learner, they're clear that they do actually want to be able to create better experiences, things that work, things that are evidence-based for learners. And finally, of course, making smart recommendations, which is around being able to make decisions that work on an individual and an organizational level in their organizations. But we have found that L&D find that data can be a little bit of a blind spot for them. And in another study by the CIPD, they've discovered that 96% of L&D professionals have identified that data analytics is a priority. However, only 24% believe they have the core data analytics skills to be able to do this. But we probably shouldn't be too hard on L&D, actually, because when we consider data maturity across organizations, we can look at Gartner for a kind of understanding of organizational data and analytics maturity. And this is a simplified model that we've kind of produced just to make it clear. They outline these 5 steps, going from basic, with data managed in silos in organizations, right the way through to transformational, with data and analytics being central to business strategy. And what they found is that when they surveyed organizations, 60% of them said that actually they're really still in the first 3 zones, so from basic to opportunistic to systematic. Now, this study was from 2017, but we often still ask our clients about this. And we find, in kind of straw polls that they're still finding themselves, in this space and moving towards differentiating. So it's not that data is a problem for L&D only. It seems to be that we are just growing our capability in understanding how to use it in the workplace. So another question that I like to ask companies and people in kind of learning development and beyond is, what barriers do they face when they're collecting data? And we asked this question in January, back when we could all hang out together at Learning Technologies. And this was what results we found from around about 2 days, probably over 100 or so industry professionals. The primary barrier that we kind of uncovered on this sort of session was that they found that data was too complicated to collect and no single data source was available. That was for around 68%. And then back around 45% of people, they were finding that they hadn't built a plan to gather data, which isn't surprising because we didn't know that that was something that needed to be in our skill set for a lot of us. And a lack of access to internal or external data was one of the next big things. So that's kind of interesting. And then the other question we ask is, well, what data are you already collecting? Because quite often we find that there's more going on than people perhaps realized. And when they really set their minds to it, you know, there is actually data being collected. And of course, no surprise here with 95% collecting course completions. But actually, I was impressed with the number of people who are collecting question attempts and answers, user comments, and really leveraging some social feeds. And also, there are some organizations where they're really looking, I think it was 39-ish%, really looking at that certification and skill competency. So that was kind of an interesting, sort of straw poll that we did. But I like to think about data just to sort of break the mold a bit more creatively. And I'm going to share an example with you now. Let me see if this can pan out nicely. I want to share with you a video. So let's see. Okay, got to do a little bit of optimizing here. Let's hope this works. Oh, no, okay. It might be a bit juddery, but I'm hoping you will get the gist of it. So let's give it a whirl and see.
What the public saw as magic was actually a carefully orchestrated feat of technology. We mounted an ADS-B antenna on the roof of a nearby building to read live data directly from each aircraft's transponder within 200 kilometers. All aircraft emit radio waves containing their speed, altitude, GPS location, and a call sign. Our antenna was connected to a PC with a custom-built application, which identified the British Airways planes and sent the data to our cloud server that controlled the billboards. We created a virtual trigger zone in the sky that acted like a tripwire, so that when a BA plane entered our trigger zone, within 0.2 seconds we'd cross-reference the registration number with flight data from Heathrow to determine the destination. Cloud altitude data told us if the plane could be seen, and if it could, the information was sent to our billboard, interrupting the current content and playing our ad.
Okay, I hope that came through okay. I really like that example. It's an Ogilvy example, it's nothing from where I work, but I think it just gives us a really creative interpretation of ways that we might be thinking about data. They're using real-time data, correlating data together, and in the end, changing an outcome that brings about a kind of real-time result. And I just think that that's a really inspiring example. So let's hop into our 6 ways then that we're going to think about data to be used for motivation, mastery, and measurement. And the things that I'll be talking about, we're going to cover some real-time leaderboards, some social benchmarking. I'll be looking a little bit at diagnostics, talking about data stories, and also thinking about measurement. So there I'll be talking about 2 things, which is email digests and dashboards using xAPI. So we just saw, didn't we, that 95% of organizations, at least in our straw poll, were collecting completion data. But one of the things that I think I'm always asking myself was, well, what happens to this data? And for most organizations, it gets stuffed away in an LMS somewhere. Nobody looks at it really, or at least if they do, maybe it's, you know, perhaps 2 or 3 people in compliance, and maybe it gets kind of recorded on and piped up the chain, you know, to show that we've met our compliance requirements. But what I would argue is that we can probably use this to work much harder for us as a tool to motivate people to participate in learning. And this is kind of a creative use case that we've tried and has been successful for us. So we've taken data from learning management systems and in real time fed that back into a visual user interface. And what you can see here is an example of that. So we've got this concept of leapers, learners, and landers. Leapers were people who hadn't started yet, according to our LMS data. Learners, people who had started, and landers, of course, were those who'd completed their training. And what you can't see is what was beneath this, which showed all of the departments across the thousands of people that were participating in this particular campaign. And it showed their initials. So at a glance, managers could look at this dashboard, senior leaders could look at the dashboard and they could see who had participated, and we were able to find out who hadn't and send them a little nudge email and make sure that they were kind of getting through their training. So the data was really kind of democratizing the whole process, and the point was people were able to contribute to the completion of this picture and really feel like they were joining in a collective goal to achieve completion together. And it was successful, and it managed to gain completions in a tight time frame, which ordinarily is not a goal for learning, but it can sometimes be a goal for organizations like retailers who have to complete training before, say, their winter season, when Christmas might be coming and they've got to have all hands on deck. And kind of moving on to with this sort of theme of sort of social and the idea of completing a goal together. This I like this quote from the psychologist Leon Festinger. It's from around about 1953, I think. He was very interested in how people social benchmark. And he says that we engage in comparison as a way of establishing a benchmark by which we can evaluate, by which we can make accurate evaluations of ourselves. And one way that we can do that in learning is through this process of social benchmarking. And many of us will know that it used to be the case that e-learning used to be a very one-way experience. We used to only be able to kind of do it in silence with our headphones on, and nothing ever kind of came back. But it's not the case anymore. With variables, we can add in crowdsourced information, feed that back in, and give people a sense of what their colleagues are also doing and thinking. We can even take it a bit further, and if we're using the right platforms, we can work out who's around while you're there and say, would you like to work collaboratively, with these other people who are online at the same time. But this is a more sort of simple example. What we're showing here is that you get asked a question, you choose your answer, and your answer gets compared to what other people have said. And then you also get the comparator from your official voice of knowledge. And the idea here is that it really improves engagement and memory recall, because according to the learning science, when we have our reward system activated, which can come from praise and recognition, it can enhance our attentiveness to a learning event and improve our memory recall. Okay, let's move on then. So we've all probably tried using diagnostics, and I think they really are probably more important, at least in my work, than we realise. We're using diagnostics here to show mastery, and the data that we're bringing in is people's self-report data. So they answer a load of questions, and this is a real one that we've produced in HTML for a client, where people answer their questions and then they get diagnosed or recommended certain personalised content. But of course, if data promises us anything, and machine learning is kind of on our side and something we can evolve towards, the potential for doing much more personalized learning is really great. And some of the things that we might be thinking about there is leveraging platforms like our learning management systems, or LRSs, to learn about how I learn and when I learn best. So for example, if my habit is that I like to learn in the evenings, well, instead of me getting pushed an email that says, do your learning now in the middle of your day, we might be able to listen to that data and alter the delivery of that push notification that says, hey, Kate, you look like you learn well on a Tuesday night. Why don't you, give this a try? So that's kind of where we can see machine learning taking us in combination, not just with the skills that we may need, but also with when we might learn best. And the important thing about that is that we can grow skills at the speed of change, which means we can be much more responsive as organizations, or organizations can be more responsive. So let's move on. This is, I suppose, a gentle criticism of learning and development, which is that they're describing rather than analysing and reporting rather than telling a story. This is it's close to my heart because I think storytelling and giving people a good story arc is an excellent way to help things be embedded and more memorable. And we can take a lesson from this when we may have this familiar situation. Perhaps we've developed a learning program or some sort of intervention or set of courses or blended learning, whatever it may be. And we really want to show to our stakeholders what we've achieved. What we're doing here is thinking about data stories. And so in this example, it's not one of my examples, it's taken from the Tampa Bay Times. It's showing historical data and sort of which has been processed and built into a story that tells the data story in a really kind of creative and analytical way using data visualization. And there are ways that we can do this. Perhaps some of you have been playing with Data Studio from Google or Tableau or Power BI, or even I've been using little extensions for Excel sometimes just to create slightly better graphs. But the point is that we're taking our historic data and we're moving it into a place like this. I mean, this is a beautiful example because a website's been produced, but we can't all afford to do that or take the time to do that. But the point is to be telling a story with our data and what's happened. And the goal here, of course, is that we want to be able to achieve buy-in and sometimes justify investments that learning departments have made. So then the fifth kind of idea is around email digests. This is kind of one of my favorites because we see this a lot. People embark on a learning campaign, and one of the frustrations, as we saw in our earlier kind of data stories, is that in our data polls, is that people just can't find the information and it's not to hand. And so something that we've done is produce these digests, which essentially pull together into one source a snapshot, which you could get them daily. These are emails that could come daily, they could come weekly. The point here is this: signups, completions, certificates downloaded. This is the kind of information that's actually available on our LMSs and or on websites. I know, for example, this was a website project. But support tickets raised and surveys completed, those sources are coming from APIs from SurveyMonkey and from Zendesk. And we can collate that together, put it in here and provide that to L&D so that when they're looking at it, they go, oh, brilliant, that's everything as I expected. Or it isn't as I expected, let me take a proactive response to that, dig into that a little bit more. So that's kind of a useful one, the email digests, and places things in one place. And you can use external sources through APIs, which is worth knowing about because some LMSs, I think even Cornerstone On Demand, they have APIs so that you can pull data into weekly digests. All right. This is my my final kind of data measurement and sort of actionable insight story, and I love this story. And if you don't like graphs, I'm going to try and bring this to life for you a little bit. What we're looking at here is a course analysis. So from along the x-axis, we're seeing the different sections of the course, and on the y-axis is time. And the line in the graph that you're seeing is, it would be typical if it weren't for this big lump at the beginning. So normally we would expect to see perhaps some time where people are doing interactions, and then we know that quite often courses have a quiz at the end, and so that tends to be where people take the longest. So that would be a kind of typical line, but this one is atypical. And what's going on here? Well, at the very beginning of this course, there was a question that was taking people on average, I think you can see, sort of 9 minutes to answer, which is a really long time for somebody to be spending in training. And what we figured out was that this was a question that was asking retail associates to sort between products that needed to be, they were age restricted products, and they needed, if you're a retailer, you had to ask somebody for ID. for these products. And it was clear that they knew about alcohol because we can drill down to the question level analysis. But they didn't know about things like matches and party poppers. And so we changed the question and made it much easier and more explicit, and said, these are the things that you need to look out for. And by doing that, what happened was people were then able to make the right challenges in the store. And it actually reduced fines, because when trading standards came in, doing kind of, spot checks and sending in underage people to try and buy matches, they weren't able to anymore, because the interaction had been changed, the training had been learned, and people knew better what to do. So I love that example, because I think that it ties together everything that we're trying to do with data, which is you're giving people an experience. By analysing what experience they've had, we're able to see where they're struggling. We can change the experience, provide them a new one, and then in the real world, they're able to act and perform in the way that is appropriate, and therefore, in this case, save their company money and reduce fines and protect reputation. So we've covered our kind of 6 things, and I just wanted to share this tool, which I hope is useful. It's something that I'm sort of working with, so I would appreciate input and feedback and thoughts. But I think when we consider data gathering, we need to be coming at it from the results side. So what is it that we're looking for? Is it growth in our organization? So, more renewals, more sales, upsells, net promoter score. What is it? Is it operational efficiency? Is it, like we just saw, risk prevention? And then we need to work back and think, well, who is this for? And it's funny, isn't it? Coming from our world, we tend to think of learners as people who are learning, but actually 99.9% of the time, we are people doing our jobs. And so I think this kind of idea that that's where the application is, that's where we're going to see the difference, needs to be considered. And so here are some thoughts on just ways that we might look to gather data at the application stage. So manager surveys, learner surveys, direct report surveys, reflection logs, which could be an app form, on-the-job tools. And then, of course, our learners move along and there's knowledge gathering. And actually, all of these are ways that we can tell whether knowledge has been gained. So we've got pre and post tests, question analysis that we saw a minute ago, evaluations of assignments, and right the way back through to utilization. Lots of people get quite excited by utilization data, and I think there's some value in it. But for me, the best picture of data is where you've got something across the learning and performance journey, and that we don't get too excited about utilization in and of itself. Utilization for me is the data that you get for free, the fact that people are clicking on your digital interactions, the fact that they've visited, what language they're in. But when you start building it all together, you can get a picture that helps support, or indeed it tells you the truth of whether or not your results are being achieved. So I hope that's kind of a useful thinking tool. Just to recap on those 6 ways we talked about: real-time leaderboards, social benchmarking, diagnostics, data stories, email digests, and dashboards. And I think that is everything from me for now before we go into Q&A. If you would like a download, I do have a download of this at this link, and also, you can catch me here. So yeah, I'm ready to take questions now.
Great, absolutely loving it, Kate. So I'm Hannah to the audience.
Hey, Hannah.
So I've got a question from Kim. Kim says, not all organisations are as sophisticated with data like the data that you are measuring. Why do the organisations that you work with care about it? What's motivating them to measure the data?
I think that comes back to the organisational maturity thing, and not all of the organisations we work with are that sophisticated necessarily. I think we try and find clients who seem to have a passion and an interest for using data in creative ways. So I think really it's about opening up the conversation early, listening to their fears. I mean, we have one really large client who they're very nervous about using data because of data security. So then we have to work through, okay, what are those fears? How would we overcome them? So I think it is really about opening up that dialogue with your clients and starting with something small potentially. The example that I showed from Tesco with the real-time data arriving on a kind of dashboard, that's quite an old example now, and it's quite a nice one because people feel quite safe with that. They're already collecting the data, it's already available, we're just using it in a different way. And those kinds of use cases and examples, I think, can help build trust with your clients, and you might be able to expand out a bit more and do more with data as they kind of see how exciting it can be. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, we have another question. What are the different characteristics between proactive and reactive L&D teams? How do we influence them towards being proactive?
Oh, I missed the very beginning part of that question, Hannah. Sorry. Do you mind saying it again?
I'm back. What are the different characteristics between proactive and reactive L&D teams? How do we influence them towards being proactive?
Can I give a candid answer? I think if you have an L&D team that wants recognition in their organization and desires change and looks forward to perhaps their own profile being raised, maybe through awards and things, that can often be quite a motivating experience. So certainly some of the clients that we like working with and do projects with that are proactive, I think they tend to be quite self-motivated and quite driven to raise the profile of L&D in their organizations, possibly to be seen in a different way. And they have their kind of personal motivations too. So that's what I've seen. People who are movers and shakers tend to be the ones that do the most with these kinds of projects.
So we have another question from Emma. How do you respond to people when they say that data is yesterday's news and expires?
Oh, I've got a bit of a hiss there. There are different types of data. There's lagging data, which is definitely going to expire and is in the past. And then there's data where we're looking forward to make predictions. So one of the things that is exciting for me about when we start thinking about machine learning is where we can get predictive analysis, how we can take historic data, combine it with other data and look towards those kind of predictive activities. So a bit like I was saying with the ability to say, when might I learn best, or what topics might I find interesting in time? Because the more machines, or the more we can learn about how we behave online and what we learn and where our gaps and skills are, the more we can kind of look to the future. I think there's value in looking back, but I think it's absolutely right that we need to be able to balance that with saying, okay, just because that happened in the past doesn't mean it will happen necessarily in the future. So I think we should always be looking to use data to inform decisions in the round and not just say, that's absolutely what happened. Evidence says so. This will happen again in the future. There's clearly other factors at play, different circumstances, environmental factors, different people, different time zones, cultural factors. So I think that's a really good question, and I like to think that we're using data to kind of push forward and use it to look towards the future more. It's a good question.
Great. We have a question from Leonard. So he says, how do you get your dashboards and visuals to a wider audience than the 1 or 2 people on the compliance team?
So we've opened them up in the past through either portals or platforms that we have, excuse me, or we've built websites and have put those dashboards in front of just through single sign-on. For example, we can sometimes put those web dashboards in front of the LMS. So if you're launching a campaign, it's the first thing that you would see. But I think getting them on the web is the way to go. Portals and websites and SSO, password protection, and if we've had some fun ideas, like one thing I'd really like to do, and we haven't done it before, but I've always had this idea that we could have an artwork or some sort of big picture that we're all developing together, and it maybe builds up as everyone's completing it, and it could be broadcast around your organization, on big plasma screens or something. Why does it need to be hidden away? But we haven't got to that level of artistry yet. Maybe one day in the future. Thanks, Leonard. Good question.
We have a question from Kate. So she says, what are some tips for telling a good story with the data, communicating insights, and or some common mistakes?
Ooh, well, I suppose any of the good practices around storytelling would apply to data. So you want to start with, oftentimes in storytelling, hilariously, I think of Rick and Morty actually, because they have a story wheel where they start off with a common world state, something that presents itself as a challenge, moving through into a completely different world state, the trade-off that you have to make to fix things, and then returning to a normal world state at the end. So if we were to take the Rick and Morty school of storytelling, we might start with, what was the issue that we saw in our organization? Why did we need to solve it and it was a problem? What's the real grit here? It needs to get interesting, and then moving it through into, here are ways that these things are being solved, and ultimately this is now the new world and how we do things. If, of course, that is what your data tells you. Your data may say it hasn't been as effective as we were hoping. So in that case, we have to be honest and say it wasn't as effective, but here are the recommendations that we're going to make and take to improve this in our next campaign. And pull out the positives, I think, because stakeholders want to hear good news, even amongst the truth, I think. I hope that's helpful.
That's great. So Nirad would like to know, how do you measure motivation using data?
Yeah, I mean, that is a good question. So the motivation for the examples that I've shown was in two ways, and I suppose it was with engagement with the social polls, and we can see that people are participating in those social polls and that learning course more actively compared to other courses. So we can make the judgment that they are more engaging, and potentially because of those techniques. And the other one, of course, was joining in the social collective, being motivated to complete a collective goal, and the evidence there for the motivation, I guess, was that people did complete it. And then there are other methods that we use that maybe aren't quite so data related, but will be more anecdotal. So especially if you've got a social platform like Workplace, we can see how many comments and shares and how much conversation is going on online to determine motivation. And then there are calculations that you can do that come from marketing, typically, where you can multiply different factors like views times shares, whatever. There's a formula. Different organizations have different formulas, which is why I'm being vague about it. And what you can do is benchmark whether or not that felt like good engagement. So for your organization, your engagement score might be 20. And if therefore you run a campaign and you're getting a 25, then you know that you've exceeded your organization's benchmark. So sometimes I think looking to marketing can be useful. Looking to where people are contributing can be useful to see how motivated they are. Are people completing in good time is sometimes a good indicator. Sometimes that can be an indicator of people being told what to do, but actually we know that in this case, because of the interventions that we put in place, it was because of them completing collective goal. And course completions in comparison to other courses which don't use the same techniques. Those would all be kind of indicators that I'd be considering for motivation. Good questions, guys.
So leading on from that, Kate, I'm curious to know, how does leaderboards impact competitiveness and morale amongst team members?
There have been some studies about whether or not leaderboards do or don't impact morale. And one of the things that we have to be careful of is that when you benchmark people against each other, sometimes for those of us who aren't motivated by points and scores, it becomes quite demotivating. So the way we've got around that before is by, because it's an organisation, it's slightly different. We've placed people into familiar groups that they're already in. So say they work in a department. When they see themselves contributing to their own department score or achievement of a result, that's slightly more anonymous, but means that you can contribute to it. You can be seen, but it's not actually all about your score personally, because some people just aren't motivated by those kind of game techniques. So yeah, probably by including people in groups where they feel familiar and allowing them to contribute to that kind of sort of team spirited competition, as opposed to individually competitive, which doesn't work for all of us. That's the way I would try and balance it, is to bring that collectivism into the leaderboards, and not try and show people low scores, because that can be demotivating. Hope that's yeah. They're my thoughts on that.
So we've got time for one more question. So it's from Nira, and he said, can we use psychometric tests and bucket group users while analysing data?
Oh, that's interesting, and I would love to have my head of product development on the call, because he talks about psychometric testing. Couple of schools of thought. His would probably be absolutely yes. And when I talked about kind of machine learning before, I think combining psychometric tests with machine learning would be an awesome way of being able to personalize people's next sets of skills or whatever behaviors that they need to achieve. Some people say psychometric tests, they don't really tell you the right kind of facts about individuals. So we need to bear in mind the two sides. But the fact that you can do digital psychometric testing and put them into platforms and compare that against other data about an individual and how they're learning, I think offers potential, if not for getting quite excited about, certainly it's worth investigating. Does require a bit of technical knowledge to be able to synthesize all that data together, but I think I'd be inclined to say yes, you can use that, and we ought to be looking into it. I'm sure somebody already is doing that. We haven't done it yet, but I think that there's an interesting discovery to happen around that, what it could lead us to in terms of kind of personalized learning and individualized learning.
Great, thank you so much. We've run out of time for questions.
You're welcome.
It was absolutely incredible. I think it's amazing. Using data for learning is so important, and I think the practicality of your session was just amazing. So thank you so much for being here at the Learning Conference.
Thank you, I've enjoyed it.
And hang tight, everyone, for the next session. It's very exciting.
Thanks.